Hi, I'm Cassandra Sabo. I'm a textile designer and hand weaver, and I'm going to show you how to weave a scented sachet from recycled materials. So the first thing we're going to do is just explain the loom a little bit. This is the heddle bar. It has notches and spaces that help to separate your warp threads. Your warp threads are the vertical yarn threads that we're going to be setting up. And what we'll be weaving in is the weft. Both of those together will make your cloth and enable you to have both the vertical and the horizontal yarns made together in a very basic pattern. We're going to be using plain weave, which is like the basic technique that you'll need for weaving. It's a great stable technique to use. We're going to be creating a small 10 centimeter by 10 centimeter sachet. So I'm going to adjust my loom. I've just set up my warp under even tension, making sure that none of the warp threads are loose and securing it both at the start and the finish so you have even tension. The warp thread is really important because it creates the basis for your weaving. So if your tension is correct and even, it's much easier to weave. Now we're going to get stuck in with weaving. We're going to use our waste materials and we're going to be using just one very simple technique, and that's called plain weave. We will be using different materials, so I'm going to try and change it up, much like this one, to get a slightly random look to the design, but of course you can use all the same colors if you want. We will be using, to start off with, just the needle, and we will need our comb, so if you have those two to hand, that would be great. The other thing that we will be using to speed the process up is called a shed stick, and this just basically creates a space when you open up your warp threads, and I'll show you how you do that in a second. So next we're going to put in our shed stick, and I'll show you how to weave the 2 rows of plain weave. We're going to start out with always picking up warp thread number 1. So we pick up all the odd numbers all the way across on the first one. So I'm just going to show you with the shed stick first what that looks like. I'm starting on the left-hand side. Generally we weave left to right because we weave following sort of reading patterns, so we always read left to right. However, if you read top to bottom or different languages, just get into a habit of thinking about being consistent. So if you start one way in terms of either starting on the left or the right, just try and be consistent, because when you come to read complex patterns later, it's much easier just to follow sort of a convention. If you can see here, I've picked up every one of the odd numbers of warp threads, and now we're going to turn what we call the shed stick on the side. So once you have your scrap yarn, and you either have it just a loose length or you're using a small amount like I am, I want you to measure the first 2 rows roughly. When I say the width of your warp, I always mean the width of your warp plus a bit extra. I always leave extra because it's easier to have a longer length than a length that's too short, and you have to then worry about it unwinding. So measure 2 widths across, then we're going to cut, and now you have your first bit of yarn. If you're going to be using more of a continuous yarn throughout the project, I'm going to suggest you use your needle. You tie a loose knot on the end of your yarn, and then we're going to weave our first row of plain weave. So again, I'm working left to right, picking up the odds first. So this is where the dexterity in my left hand comes in handy. It's really quick and easy for me to do. Then I'm not going to push it right down to the bottom. I'm going to kind of leave it floating there for a minute, and then we're going to use the shed stick to open up the second row of weave, which is again the even numbers, and then I'm just simply going to pass it through. So now we've created the first 2 rows of our warp threads, and I'm going to undo the needle. And so I'm just doing the first 2 rows of this because the pattern we're creating, I want it to be stable. That's why plain weave is so important. It's the most stable, and it's the basic pattern that you will use in weaving. Next, we're going to do the next row of plain weave, and I'm going to choose another yarn, and I'm again measuring and cutting. I might use the bigger scissors, more comfortable. Next thing I'm going to use is my fingers. Because we're only doing 1 row, I find it actually almost easier, takes less time than threading a needle. I'll just use my fingers. And then we take that yarn, roughly get it close to the bottom, and then push down. That's row number 2. And so I'm essentially alternating each row, evens, odds, evens, odds. That's all plain weave is. It just continues all the way to the top of your project. So now we've more or less finished our square. It doesn't have to be the perfect size. Again, whatever works for you and sort of in your mindset what sort of size you want to create. We're going to take it off the loom now. So we're going to slide our shed stick off First thing we're going to do is we have the option to tuck in these ends. I'm going to leave these ends loose so that we can create a fringe. It'll make it a little bit more challenging later on because it means that when we come to putting our sachet together, you'll have to kind of navigate them, but I think it's kind of like a fun look. So the technique we're going to use is we're first of all going to cut the first warp thread like here, like I've done. We're going to hold on to that because we are going to also remove the one next to it, so that there's a pair of warp threads. So just making sure this one doesn't fly off the sides. We are going to cut this one and we are simply going to knot these two together. So this is why we didn't start by pushing our work right to the bottom of the frame loom. We left a little bit of floating time because in order to create the space to tie these knots, it can be quite tricky. We want to try and keep as much height as possible. So this one I might lower this one a little bit. So you'll notice that this first one's going to want to slide a little bit because we haven't had anything in between to secure it. So first thing we're going to do is to make sure that that doesn't slide off is we're going to quickly work from left to right, knotting pairs of warp threads together at both the top and the bottom, but start bottom, top, bottom, top, bottom, top, and work your way along. So when you're coming to the end, you want to make sure that you're removing it from the loom and making sure that this last knot is tied to its neighbor so that everyone is sort of knotted as a pair. So here's the first sample. It looks a little bit messy at the moment, but what we're going to do is we're going to now create the second side and we're going to match the two together and we're going to alternate. So the fringe on the first one will be sitting horizontally and the other one will be vertically. So we'll kind of have fringe all around the outskirts. So I'll show you how to do that next. Okay, so now we've actually finished knotting both the warp and the weft. You'll have some chunkier knots on the weft side, which is totally fine. To make the next step easier, I think what we're going to do first is we're going to trim the edges. So we're going to make it so that they're all roughly the same length. Now, if you like it more relaxed and kind of different, you know, sort of more bohemian style where everything is not so perfect, that's totally fine as well. You can just leave it. So now we have everything hopefully looking a little bit easier to knot together. We are then going to match our sides together, and as you can see they are slightly longer than they are tall. That's totally fine because it'll work its way out in the end. And what we're going to do is we are going to look for the first knot from our warp. So the warp, again, just to remind you, is going to be the solid color, and then we're going to match it up with each of the knots from the different colors. And the other thing we're going to do is that basically we're going to be weaving it together on the wrong sides together. So often when you do sewing, you sort of do the right sides together and then you flip it inside out. I'm starting with the side that I can see, which is the solid knots of the warp. I'm going to take my yarn to sew it all together, and I'm just going to be picking up the warp thread that is just below the knot on one side and then looking for the matching warp thread or weft thread on the side here in between the first and second knot. So we've got our first knot here, and I'm bringing these two warp and weft threads together. So just pulling those two together, pulling it through. So now here we're going to create again a knot at the end. So as if it was going to be pulled through. And then, so then it should stop, and we're going to weave that end in afterwards so that it's secured. And then we are looking for the next knot. So we're coming in through the next knot. And this becomes a little bit tricky to follow as you're going along because a lot of the colors are similar, but it helps if you don't tangle things up. So first knot under our belt is that corner one. That's the second one. Okay, there we go. We can see that a bit better. So we're trying to just get our needle in and under the knot on each side, moving the knots as we go. And then our very last one on this side, which is the warp thread again, the blue. So here we've come to the end of our three sides. We've sewn all three sides together, so you should have your sort of knots sitting on the outside and your sort of fringe on the other side. If I was to put my hand inside, you can see that we are getting close to making our sachet, which is kind of fun. So what we're going to do now is I'm just going to keep my yarn connected that I've managed to work around. I'm going to grab my lavender and I'm going to pop it inside. So next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually forcing it to kind of fill that gap up. And if you can see here, I'm just trying to open up and stretch the yarn so that it fills. And so we're going to resume sewing it together just like we were before. So we're coming through to sort of the last few knots where we're knotting it together. What you want to do is make sure that you're tying it and securing it tight enough so that everything is closing up, particularly this other end. The other ends will be sort of stretched now, but this last one you want to make sure that they're secure and tight. And so I think we're nearly there. We've got 2 or 3 more. So again, coming round to the corner, almost to the corner. So last 2, so we've got our last colorful one, then we've got our last knot. Okay, so we've come to the corner, and if you recall at the beginning, we had one loose thread, which we were going to weave in, which is now actually on the inside, so that's quite good. But what I want you to do with this last one is I want you to weave that down the side just a few rows underneath the same weft threads you did originally, to pull it through to the side. And then we're going to pull it through on the edge. I'm going to pull it through on the edge underneath the knots so that we kind of secure it. So now it's been woven in and we can safely trim it so that that end. So here we have the sachet. So the last thing we're going to do is I'm going to try and just manipulate it so it looks a little bit more square. And the very last thing is take your scissors and just cut through any of these warp ends or any of the other loops that you may have found that you want to make sure that they're all in a fringe shape. So here you have your finished scented lavender sachet. If you've used lavender, then it's fantastic for keeping sort of moths at bay. You could put it in your drawer or pop it into your closet because it's really great for, yeah, just keeping your clothes nice and fresh scented, and those moths, definitely keep those away. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you want to learn more about me and my process, check out my online course at Domestika. You'll find the link in the description below.